The first thing Miriam ever built was a cage. She had been 7 years old, and the bones she used belonged to a river elk her father had slaughtered at the edge of the Enoch marshes. She lashed them together with sinew and river reeds, constructing something that had walls, a ceiling, a floor, a contained world, small enough to hold in both hands. Her father had watched her from across the fire and said nothing. His silence was not approval. It was the particular quiet of a man who recognizes something in his child that he does not fully understand and therefore fears. She had placed a sparrow inside. The sparrow had not sung. It had pressed itself against the far wall and stared at her with one black eye, perfectly still as though it understood that movement was no longer meaningful. She had released it before nightfall, but the memory of that eye, that single unblinking amber dark eye, had followed her into womanhood like a stone tied to her ankle. She thought of it now, standing at the edge of the great plateau of Ashur-Kalem, looking down at the city she had helped bring into being. It sprawled across the valley below her like a wound that had calcified into architecture. The walls were black basalt quarried from the obsidian ranges 300 miles to the east, dragged here not by human hands, but by the Nephilim themselves, who had carried the stone blocks on their shoulders, the way a man might carry a sack of grain. Casually, without ceremony, as though the weight of mountains was merely inconvenient rather than impossible. The streets were wide enough to accommodate their strides, which meant they were wide enough for 20 men to walk abreast without touching. The doorways of the great structures stood 40 feet tall, framed in cedar beams the width of ancient oaks, their lintels carved with scenes of the watchers descending from the heavens in columns of fire and smoke, their wings spread like storm systems, their faces depicted not as human but as something between man and star, radiant, terrible, geometrically perfect in a way that living faces never were. Miriam had carved some of those lintels herself. Her hands still ached from the work. She was 23 years old, and she was the finest architect the human clans of the lower Tigrath Valley had ever produced. This was not a distinction she had sought. It had been assigned to her the way weather is assigned to a season, without negotiation, without her consent. When the Nephilim lord called Garrison had come to the valley 3 years ago, moving through the human settlements like a living tower, his head level with the rooftops, his footsteps leaving depressions in the earth 6 inches deep, he had asked the clan elders a single question: "Who among your people understands the language of stone?" They had brought her forward. She had not wept. She had not begged. She had looked up at Garrison's face, so far above her that she had to lean back to see it fully, a face like carved granite softened by something almost like compassion, his eyes the pale silver gray of a winter sky just before it decides to become a storm. And she had understood with the absolute clarity of someone who has just watched a door close behind them forever that her life now belonged to the city. Ashur-Kalem. The name meant, in the old tongue that the Watchers had taught the first generations of humanity, the place where heaven remembers its distance. She had thought it poetic when Garrison first spoke it to her, standing in the ruins of the elder construction that had preceded the current city, its ancient foundations still visible beneath the newer stones, like bones beneath skin. Now she understood it differently. Heaven's distance was not a lament, it was a deliberate choice, and the city was a monument to everything that had been built in the space that distance created. The houses. She had to think about the houses. This was the task Garrison had set before her at dawn, when he had summoned her to the planning chamber. A room so vast that her voice produced an echo before she finished speaking, a room whose ceiling was painted in lapis and gold, with astronomical maps depicting star systems she did not recognize, constellations from skies that had never been visible from Earth. He had unrolled a section of parchment. The parchment itself was made from the skin of an animal she could not identify, something enormous, something that had once existed and no longer did, and he had pressed his enormous finger against a section of the city's western quarter and said in his voice that resonated not just in the ears but in the sternum, the teeth, the deep architecture of the body's interior. The human dwellings are insufficient. Redesign them. She had not asked what insufficient meant. She had learned in 3 years that questions directed at Garrison were best posed only when the answer was necessary for survival. Instead, she had taken the parchment, rolled it carefully, tucked it under her arm, and walked here to the plateau's edge to look at the city and think. The human dwellings in Ashur-Kalem were clustered in the western and northern quarters, pressed against the great outer wall like smaller animals sheltering in the lee of something larger. They were built according to human proportions: doorways 6 feet high, rooms 12 feet wide, ceilings low enough to retain heat, windows narrow to keep out the river wind that swept down from the Tigrath each evening, smelling of mud and distance. They were built from the same black basalt as the rest of the city, because that was the material available. But their construction was different, more careful, more human. The stones fitted together with patient precision rather than the brute geometric authority that characterized the Nephilim structures. Some of them had small gardens in their interior courtyards. Some had clay pots arranged on their windowsills containing herbs, flowers, the small persistent domesticities of human life continuing in defiance of their surroundings. She had built many of them herself. Or rather, she had designed them, and the human workers, her people, the clan builders, the stone shapers and mortar mixers who had been relocated to the city over the past 2 years, had built them under her direction. She knew the weight of each wall. She knew how the light entered the eastern windows in the morning, and how the shadows moved across the interior floors in the long afternoons, and how the sound of the city changed at night when the Nephilim withdrew to their great structures, and the human quarter fell into a silence that was almost peaceful, almost familiar, almost like the silence of the valley they had all come from. Almost, but not quite. Because the human houses of Ashur-Kalem were built inside a city whose fundamental logic was not human, and that disjunction, that gap between the scale of human living and the scale of the city that contained it, was something Miriam felt every day in her body, the way you feel a badly healed bone in cold weather. The streets were too wide, the Nephilim structures too tall. The shadows they cast fell at wrong angles, covering the human quarter at hours when by rights the sun should have reached it, creating a permanent penumbra in certain streets where daylight arrived only briefly, obliquely, like an apology. The human children who had grown up in Ashur-Kalem were quieter than children ought to be. They played in the interior courtyards rather than the streets. They had learned, through whatever process children use to absorb the unspoken rules of their environment, that the open spaces of the city were not for them. Miriam descended from the plateau along the carved stone stairway, each step built for Nephilim feet, which meant each step was 18 inches high, which meant that her descent was a constant, careful negotiation with gravity, and walked into the city. She walked through the Nephilim quarter first. This was not strictly necessary for her task, but she did it deliberately, the way a physician probes a wound to understand its full extent. The great structures rose around her, and she let herself see them the way she had learned to see buildings, not as backdrops but as arguments. Every architecture was an argument, her first teacher had told her, a position taken in stone about what the world is and who it is for. The Nephilim towers argued for verticality. They argued for the rejection of the human relationship to the earth, that intimate horizontal relationship of people who build low and dig gardens and bury their dead close to where they sleep. The towers reached upward with a determination that felt theological. Their facades were not decorated with scenes of daily life. There were no images of harvests or marriages or the small transactional joys of human existence. Instead, they bore astronomical records, genealogical inscriptions tracing the lineage of the Watchers back through generations of celestial existence to an origin point that the inscriptions referred to only as the first fire. There were maps of heavenly territories. There were what appeared to be legal documents, contracts of immense complexity, written in the angular script the Watchers had invented before they taught the adapted version to humanity. She had spent 3 years studying that script. She could read perhaps 1 word in 10. The word she saw most often, repeated in the inscriptions like a refrain, was a word she had eventually learned to translate as belonging. Everything in Ashur-Kalem, every stone, every carved lintel, every courtyard paved in obsidian tile, everything belonged to the Watchers. The city was not a settlement. It was a claim. She walked deeper into the central district where the largest of the Nephilim structures stood, the one the human workers called the Hall of First Names, though she did not know if that was what the Nephilim called it. It was a building of such extraordinary scale that standing at its base produced a specific physical sensation, a kind of structured vertigo, the body's instinctive recognition that it was in the presence of something built for a different order of being. Its walls were 200 feet tall. Its entrance was flanked by 2 columns carved in the shape of winged figures, not the naturalistic wings of birds, but something more abstract, more terrible, wings as pure geometry, as the idea of wings stripped of any biological origin, suggesting that what they represented had never needed wings for flight, because flight was simply an expression of their nature. She had helped carve those columns. Garrison had stood beside her for 3 days while she worked, watching with an expression she could not read, occasionally reaching down with one enormous finger to indicate a line that needed correction. She had not looked at the columns since their completion. She looked at them now. Between the columns, barely visible in the shadows of the entrance, something moved. Miriam stopped walking. The figure that emerged from the shadow of the Hall of First Names was not Garrison. It was another of the Nephilim, one she did not recognize. Younger, she thought, though she had learned that age in the Nephilim was not expressed through the physical deterioration that marked human aging. This one stood perhaps 130 feet tall, with a build that was lean rather than massively architectural like Garrison's, and features that were more angular, more severe, the silver of his eyes shading toward something colder, more analytical. He looked down at her with an expression of pure scientific interest, the way she might look at an unfamiliar insect encountered on a stone wall. She stood her ground. She had learned this too, in 3 years. That movement in the presence of the Nephilim when you had not been addressed was inadvisable. They noticed movement the way predators notice it, not with hostility necessarily, but with an automatic redirecting of attention that felt like being caught in a current. He spoke. His voice was different from Garrison's, higher in register, which still meant it resonated in the chest. But there was something more precise about it, more clipped, like mathematical notation rendered as speech. He spoke in the old tongue, the Watcher language, and she understood perhaps half of what he said, enough to grasp that he was asking her a question. She replied in the same language, haltingly, constructing the sentence with the careful effort of someone working in a language that was not native, but had been partially mastered through necessity. She told him who she was. She told him her function, architect of the human quarter. She told him she was assessing the dwellings for redesign on Garrison's instruction. He listened, his head tilted slightly to one side, a gesture that looked almost human, almost like the gesture of someone genuinely engaged in listening rather than simply waiting for sound to stop. Then he crouched, the movement of a being who had learned to accommodate the smallness of others, lowering himself to what was for him a position of some effort, but brought his face to approximately 20 feet above hers, close enough that she could see the structure of his eyes, those silver irises with their concentric rings that were not rings at all, but patterns, moving patterns, like weather systems in miniature, like the surface of the deep water before a storm. He told her something. She understood this time almost every word. He told her that the human dwellings were not being redesigned for the comfort of their inhabitants. He told her that the architects before her, there had been others, she had not known this, the knowing of it landed like cold water, had failed to understand the secondary function of the structures. He told her that every building in Ashur-Kalem was also an instrument, that the angles of the walls, the ratios of window to wall, the depth of the foundations relative to the height of the structure, these were not aesthetic choices. They were tuned. The city was a device of immense complexity, every structure a component, and its function was related to the inscriptions she had read on the towers, related to that word belonging, related to something she did not yet have the language to name. She asked him what happened to the architects before her. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said a single word that she understood completely and wished she had not. Gone. She walked back through the city with the afternoon light falling at its strange angles around her, the shadows of the Nephilim towers crossing the human quarter in those geometrically precise lines that she now understood were not incidental, but intentional, part of the tuning, part of the instrument. She walked into the western quarter, into the street she knew best, and she stopped in front of a house she had designed herself 2 years ago, one of the first in the expanded district. She looked at it with new eyes. The doorway was 6 feet high. Human scale, she had insisted on that. A small insistence. One of the few she had been permitted. The stones of the walls were fitted with the care she always brought to human structures. The mortar lines clean, the courses level. The window faced east for morning light. There was a clay pot on the sill with something green growing in it. She put her hand against the wall. The stone was warm from the afternoon sun. Beneath her palm she felt, or imagined she felt, she could not be certain, a very faint vibration, like a tone at the very lowest edge of hearing, the frequency at which the body rather than the ear receives sound. She pressed her palm flat. The vibration, if it was real, continued. She thought about what it meant to build a house. She had always thought of it as a human act in its most fundamental sense. The claiming of space against the indifference of the world, the inscription of human presence into the landscape, the defiant declaration that here inside these walls, something that matters is happening. Her first teacher had told her, a house is the first philosophy. Before religion, before law, before language itself, there was the house, the enclosed space, the interior world set against the exterior, the yes and the no of a threshold. But if the walls were tuned, if the foundations were instruments, if the geometry was a language she had been speaking without knowing it, writing arguments into stone that she had never consciously chosen to make, what then was a house? She thought of the sparrow in its cage of elk bone and river reed, pressing itself against the far wall, perfectly still. She thought of its single black eye. She went home. Her own small house, 2 rooms, identical in construction to the other she had built, because she had not given herself special treatment, and she lit her lamp, and she unrolled Garrison's parchment on the floor, and she sat beside it, and she did not look at it. She looked at the wall. She looked at the precise fit of the stones, the mortar lines she had watched the workers press into place with their hands. She looked at the window, dark now with night, the clay pot silhouetted against the stars. Outside, somewhere in the city, something moved, something large. The vibration in the walls intensified briefly, then subsided. She picked up her carving tool, the small iron chisel she used for detailed inscription work, and she pressed its point against the mortar between 2 stones. The mortar was set hard, 2 years old, strong, but not unbreakable. She pressed harder. A small line appeared, a fracture, a beginning. She sat back and looked at what she had done. A single crack in a single mortar line, invisible to any eye but hers, meaningless in isolation, the smallest possible negation of the instrument she had built. Outside, the city breathed in its tuned frequencies. The towers cast their calculated shadows across the streets. The Nephilim moved through their great halls, reading their astronomical contracts, tracing their lineages back to the first fire, making their enormous claims upon the world in stone and angle and the geometry of belonging. She put out the lamp. In the darkness, she held the chisel against her chest and listened to the walls. And the walls, she was certain of it now, in the way you are certain of things you cannot prove but cannot doubt. The walls listened back, above the city, so high that from the ground they were invisible. The stars of a sky she did not recognize traced their patterns through the night. And in the foundations of Ashur-Kalem, 4,500 years before a flood that would unwrite everything, the first crack in the instrument widened by precisely the width of 1 iron chisel and held.